Hello everyone, my name is Wimzo the Great and today we'll be talking about the upcoming PlayStation Classic console. As you might know, on December the 3rd, the PlayStation Classic will be released by Sony. If I'm not mistaken, that's even on the 20th anniversary of the console. Now, recently at the end of October, Sony revealed the 20 games that will be included on the console. And while I can agree that they've made a couple of great choices, definitely not all of the games would have been on my personal final cut. That's what I like to talk about today. In this video, we'll take a look at all of the games they've decided to put on the console, and I will also give you my own personal opinion whether these games should be included or should have been included or not, and which games would have been a better choice. Now first of all, I'd like to give Sony some credit where credit's due. There is certainly a lot of variety on the upcoming PS Classic. There is something on this console for every kind of gamer, and that's great. But this variety has also caused lots of great or even better games to not make the final cut, which is a shame. Now let's take a look at the fighting games that will be included on the PS Classic. First off, you have Tekken 3. I think this game is not really up for debate. My favorite fighting game on the PlayStation 1 is probably Tekken 2, but that's mostly out of nostalgia reasons because that's the one that I grew up with when I was a kid. However, it's fair to say that everyone can agree on the fact that Tekken 3 is an amazing classic and that it definitely deserves or has its place on the console. It's pretty much the best fighting game that ever got released on the PlayStation. The second fighting game is Battle Arena Toshinden, or however you pronounce it, I'm not sure. Anyway, this is a game I've never played, but I played lots of other great fighting games on the console, and I think that this one doesn't really deserve a spot on the PS Classic. I mean, if you get to choose only 20 games, this one would definitely not make my final cut. It received favorable reviews back in the days for sure, but the same can be said of other candidates. I like the huge cast of characters and controls in Street Fighter Alpha 3, for instance, and I like the gory fatalities in Mortal Kombat. I mean, who doesn't like those kind of games? I like the unique gaming mechanics in games like Bloody Roar, where your character could transform an animal, and I also liked a game called Rival Schools. Not many people know this one, but it was a beat 'em up game just like Tekken, except that you had special attacks, and with these special attacks you could team up with a partner and then beat a certain character together. It was pretty cool, and it has always stuck with me ever since. I also liked the more tactical approach of Dead or Alive and Bushido Blade, and the latter is actually one of my favorite couch co-op games. So there's lots of great options here that could have replaced Battle Arena Toshinden. If I'm missing anything here, feel free to let me know. Now onto something that I found difficult to put in a certain niche. You could say it's a sports game, I guess, and I'm talking about Cool Borders 2. I've played the demo of Cool Borders 3 a lot back when I was a kid and I enjoyed it. But to put it on the PS Classic, I don't know, man. It's received mixed to favorable reviews, I guess, but it was certainly not a system seller, like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was, for instance. Especially the second game in the Tony Hawk series was an amazing game, but should have always replaced Cool Borders on this list. Sony also included two games that I would define as combat race games, I guess, even though that term might not really be the exact one. Anyway, we have Destruction Derby and Twisted Metal, and both of them are great games that deserve to be on here, but adding two of these games on the console might be a bit overdoing it. I would personally switch Twisted Metal for Twisted Metal 2 to begin with, because that game's definitely an improvement on the first one. And then, in the end, I would probably switch Destruction Derby for a game that came from a different genre. The PlayStation is known for the many amazing role-playing games it delivered over its lifespan. Honestly, there are so many great ones that you could probably make a PlayStation Classic console with only RPG games on it. That might be something for a future video though, but for now, let's look at the games they've included on the console. The first one is an obvious choice, everybody knows it and many people grew up with it. Final Fantasy VII is on the PS Classic and nobody will complain about that, but the fact that it's on the system, and it clearly seems that Sony wanted to add as much variety as possible, also means that they excluded the unforgettable Final Fantasy Tactics and the very solid Final Fantasy IX. The other games in this genre are Wild Arms and Revelations Persona. Both of them are good games, don't get me wrong, but I believe there are much better options here. My main issue with Revelations Persona is that it definitely didn't age well. Persona 5 on the PS4 made me a huge fan of the Persona series, but when I started playing the first installment of the series, I quickly lost interest because of its stale combat and how difficult it was to find your way everywhere. Every building looks the same and it's never really clear what you're supposed to do or where you're supposed to go. All in all, Persona certainly came a long way ever since, and even for its time I guess it was probably a great game, but nowadays it's not up to its original standards. In regards to Wild Arms, I don't have many complaints. It's one of the better RPGs on the system, and as I mentioned before, there's a lot of them, so it's one of the most difficult choices to make in the end. Personally, I would have swapped Persona for either Chrono Cross or Suikoden 2. It still baffles me to this day that Suikoden 2 didn't sell well, because it's an amazing game. I like its tactical versatility and the different combat systems, while for Chrono Cross, it was a beautiful game that received critical acclaim, everybody liked it. It also had to live up to the praise of its predecessor, Chrono Trigger. Very difficult to do, but they still managed to do it actually. It was no small feat. You could also run away from every battle in the game, including boss battles, and just like in Chrono Trigger, there were no random encounters. Now, choosing between these two games would have been heartbreaking enough for me, but right here I would like to break a lance for one of my favorite games ever, and that is Jade Cocoon. I was blown away by this game the first time I played it on the demo disc. It was only many years later that I finally managed to play the entire game. I don't think there's a single thing I dislike about Jade Cocoon. I mean, it was fully voiced, the art style and the scenery was bursting full of life, and merging the monsters you've captured together to create an entirely new species was so addictive that I could do it for hours and hours on end. I would be playing days without even advancing the game and just merging monsters to make one super monster. Anyway, there's lots of great RPGs as I already said, so I'll also be giving some honorable mentions here, and they go to The Legend of Dragoon, Grandia and Vagrant Story. Now on to the next genre, which is action games. There's a couple of games that could have been added to this genre, but none of them except for Grand Theft Auto would have this as a main genre. Of course GTA has to be on here. Once again, whether the first game should be the one they've chosen or the second or third game is up for debate. I guess Grand Theft Auto kind of thrives on the success of GTA 5, and fans will be having lots of fun diving back into the first game. Nonetheless, there might have been better options if you would have opted for an action game. In my opinion, Tomb Raider is tremendously missed on the PS Classic. It didn't age that well, I guess, but neither did GTA. And let's not forget that Tomb Raider 2 sold over 8 million copies and Lara Croft became a worldwide phenomenon back in the day. Another action game I really liked, and maybe even more than Tomb Raider, was Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. The opening scene of Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver even scarred me for life as a kid. You should look this stuff up on YouTube if you didn't play the game yet, or better even, try out the game yourself. It's definitely worth your time. Now in the end, I would probably pick Legacy of Kain over Tomb Raider, because Tomb Raider is still pretty much alive these days, while Legacy of Kain isn't. So if you want the real system seller for the PS Classic, then Legacy of Kain probably be your game to go with. Next up are the platformer games. Before delving deeper into this, I'd like to make clear that I personally believe that certain platformers didn't make it on the PS Classic because they were either recently re-released or they will be getting a remaster in the near future. Mainly I believe this is the case for games like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon and Medieval. Crash Bandicoot The Insane Trilogy was a huge success, while Spyro's Reignited Trilogy will be arriving next week, and Medieval is scheduled for somewhere in 2019. While all of these are still getting attention today, I believe this is not the case for Castlevania, which didn't receive a new game in years. Many people deem Castlevania Symphony of the Night to be one of the best games ever made, and therefore it's a damn shame they didn't add it on the PS Classic. I guess you could call this game a platformer action game, so that's why I'm talking about it right now. Now Rayman is the first game I'd like to talk about that was included on the PS Classic. It was a gorgeous game, it was charming and had a great level design. I never made it past the music world for instance, and I highly doubt I'll be able to even complete it nowadays. But a little challenge is always welcome, and Rayman is a nice addition to the list of the PS Classic, nothing to complain about here. The same goes for the next game, and that is Oddworld Apes Odyssey. Talk about hard games, by the way, this is another one. I've put it in the platformer genre because I didn't really know where else to put it. The controls are kinda clunky for a platformer, I guess. It has a real great story going on, and there are lots of puzzle elements found throughout the game. If you've been a PlayStation fan or a gamer for years, ever since the PlayStation 1 era, then you will definitely know Abe. And he's one of the characters that really had to be added to the game library of the PS Classic. So once again, no complaints here. Now the last game in this genre that I'd like to talk about is Jumping Flash. I have to be honest here, I didn't play Jumping Flash at all, and I actually never even heard of it before. After seeing some gameplay on YouTube, the only thing I can say about this one is that it's probably served its purpose well. It made full use of the 3D capabilities of the PlayStation, but by no means does it seem to be like a game that everybody should know or play. In that regard, I will be glad to switch it out for something better, in my humble opinion. And I'm going to take the time here to promote one of my favorite games of all time. And one of my fondest childhood memories, and that is Klonoa Door to Phantomhill. Gosh, I still love Klonoa up to these days. So much. Klonoa deserves a fanbase like Crash Bandicoot still has these days. It deserved way more than a sequel on PlayStation 2 and a remake on the Wii. The gameplay mechanics are great, the story is appealing, and the feels that I had during the ending scene will always be a fond memory of mine. If there is an old school game I'd recommend you to play, it's probably this one. It also aged quite well, by the way, so you can still enjoy it these days. It's not really a long game, you can finish it in one sitting, in one afternoon. But even if you're not a Klonoa fan, after trying the game I think you will agree that this one deserves to be on the PS Classic much more than Jumping Flash. Once again, I will be handing out some honorable mentions here because the PlayStation had some amazing platformers. First of all, you have Ape Escape. That one would have probably made the list if the old classic PlayStation controllers would have had joysticks. Since that isn't the case, they couldn't add it to the PS Classic library, logically, because that makes the game unplayable. Then you have Toomba. That's a game series I enjoy playing for a while, but eventually the weird way you had to jump back and forth to the background made me quit the game without completing it. It was a bit confusing, and it was also very challenging. I never managed to beat it. Now another decent platformer game that could have been a great substitute for Jumping Flash is Gag's Enter the Gecko. Another great game that you should try out if you have the time. Now the PS Classic has one survival horror game, and of course we all know which game defined the survival horror genre for many years to come. So Resident Evil was a great game for its time. Once again, another game that didn't age too well, I guess, but if you want to experience this classic survival horror game, I guess this is your chance. Now there's also a more recent remaster, if you're not into outdated graphics and gameplay, so in the end everybody can be happy here. Now the main idea is that the second game in the series is better than the predecessor, so whether they've chosen the right installment of Resident Evil here is up for debate. I would have chosen Resident Evil 2 myself, but honorable mentions that didn't make it on my personal PS Classic list would have been either Dino Crisis or Silent Hill. Silent Hill, I guess, leans more towards a psychological horror adventure, rather than the monsters and gore that Resident Evil has. So if you're more into creepy music, creepy scenery and weather, then Silent Hill is probably the game that you should give a try. Dino Crisis on the other hand is a more action-oriented survival horror game. On to the race games. I'm not really a fan of race games, I barely played any of them at all because I'm just not good at them. However, I did play lots of race games on the PlayStation demos, including Gran Turismo and Ridge Racer Type 4. The latter game is the one that Sony went with for its classic console, and since it received universal acclaim, there's nothing really to be angry about here. I would probably have picked Crash Team Racing myself, but of course that one is not really a realistic racing game to begin with. In the end, from an objective point of view, I would say that Gran Turismo 2 is arguably the best race game that ever came out on the PlayStation, but Ridge Racer Type 4 is also a fine choice. In the end it doesn't matter, because Crash Team Racing will always be the one and only race game I'll ever play, so I would pick it over any of these two any time of day. The next big genre we'll be covering is the stealth genre. First of all, we have the amazing Metal Gear Solid. I'm glad to see that it's on the PS Classic, and probably no one will argue that it shouldn't be on there, because it's one of the greatest games of all time. It defined the stealth genre as a whole, and the cutscenes were awesome for its time. The second game is partially stealth game, partially shooter, but I guess the gameplay leans more on stealth mechanics in the end, so the one I'm talking about is Siphon Filter. Once again, it's a pretty good addition to the PS Classic, but in the end it wouldn't have made my personal list, and mainly because of the following reason. And let me take this time to break another lance for one of my favorite PlayStation games of all time. Tenchu, or Tenchu, I don't know how to pronounce it, the Stealth Assassins. Now, I'm a huge sucker for anything Japanese to begin with. Furthermore, this game was easy to learn but hard to master. And I really loved the level design, how you could approach your goal in many different ways. The game lets you walk around freely on big maps, but your main objective was always to take out your opponents as stealthily as possible, and you had many different ways to approach them. So a great game, I highly recommend it. It's not as good as Metal Gear, but it's better than Siphon Filter in my opinion. Its biggest drawback is the English voice acting, but that's only bothersome in the cutscenes, so it's alright. Now there's one fully fledged shooter on here, and while we are talking about games that made the list because of how popular the franchises are these days, this might be another one of them. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six is on here. The original PlayStation 1 game received mostly negative reviews. I believe they could have chosen pretty much any shooter for the PS Classic and it would have been a better choice than this one. You had Doom, you had Quake, Alien Resurrection, Medal of Honor, Duke Nukem, you name it. But Rainbow Six? Now don't get me wrong, the PC version is great, but the console version is pretty much a big letdown. Now, I've never been a big fan of shooter games in general, and definitely not on console, since I believe that aiming with the controller is always much more difficult and feels less natural than with a mouse. But if I really had to pick one that's better than Rainbow Six, I would probably pick Medal of Honor. Games like Duke Nukem, Quake and Doom, they are way better on PC anyways. The final three games I like to talk about here are the puzzle games that were included in the PS Classic package. I'll be blunt with these games. None of them would have made it on my list. There's way too many great other games on the PS1 that are much better than this one, because the PS1 had a pretty lackluster puzzle library to begin with. And Sony actually had the audacity to include no less than 3 puzzle games on their PS Classic. These are Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, Intelligent Cube and Mr. Driller. All of these games received favorable reviews, but none of them are classics. I challenge anyone to ask a random gamer to name about 20 classic PlayStation 1 games, and it would highly surprise me if that person would name any of these 3. If I really had to pick one of these 3, I would probably pick Mr. Driller, because that's maybe the rarest one of the bunch. But in the end, all of these games could have been switched for much better choices. I guess it's pretty clear by now that Sony wanted to include a variety of video game genres, but why pick 3 puzzle games while there's not a single rhythm game on the console? Parappa the Rapper would have been a great addition, for instance, but that one also received a recent PS4 remaster, so that might be the reason why they didn't include it. Otherwise it just had to be. It's one of the most memorable games from the PS1 era, and Parappa is also a great PlayStation mascot. Another great rhythm game they could have added was Bust a Groove. I had a lot of fun with this game as a kid. It's not the best game, but if you want variety, this one would have been a great choice for the PS Classic. Another great game that I couldn't really put in a certain niche or genre would be Worms Armageddon. Worms is a great couch co-op game to play with family and friends, and just trying out all the different kinds of weapons with your worms was so much fun. The PlayStation has never been a good console for strategy games, I guess. If you have a great game like Worms, you should definitely add it on the list. So that about covers up my views on the upcoming PS Classic. What follows now is a final summary of the games that will be included on the PS Classic, and the ones that I would have preferred to be on the PS Classic. So the games that will be included are Battle Arena Toshinden, Tekken 3, Cool Borders 2, Destruction Derby, Twisted Metal, Final Fantasy VII, Wild Arms, Revelations Persona, Grand Theft Auto, Rayman, Oddworld Apes Odyssey, Jumping Flash, Resident Evil, Ridge Racer Type 4, Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, Intelligent Cube, Mr. Driller, Siphon Filter, Metal Gear Solid, and Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. I would have personally switched Battle Arena Toshinden for Bushido Blade, because it's a different and more realistic style of fighting that should be included on this list. I would have switched Cool Borders 2 for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, because that game just has to be on the PS Classic. I would have switched Destruction Derby for Tomb Raider 2, because we don't need to have 2 combat racing games on the PS Classic. I would have switched Twisted Metal for Twisted Metal 2 because that game's just better than its predecessor. Wild Arms for Suikoden 2 and Revelations Persona for Chrono Cross, mainly because those two games are way better games, and they age better as well. I would have switched Grand Theft Auto in the end, I guess, for Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, but that's a personal choice. Grand Theft Auto is a great game that definitely deserves a place on the list. But once again, it didn't age well, and Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver is a better game in my opinion, and it didn't have as much of a legacy, as Grand Theft Auto. So it's a game that is easily forgotten these days. That's why I'm including it right now. Then I would probably switch Jumping Flash for Clonoa Door to Phantom Mill, because that's an amazing game that should not be forgotten ever. And then I would probably switch Resident Evil for either Resident Evil 2 or Silent Hill, depending on what kind of horror you like. I would switch Ridge Racer Type 4 for Gran Turismo 2 if I would be a racing game fan, but I'm not, so I'm going to choose Crash Team Racing here instead. Then I would probably switch Super Puzzle Fighter 2 for Bust a Groove, Intelligent Cube for Worms Armageddon, and Mr. Driller for Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Just because of more variety and because obviously Worms and Castlevania are games that are instant classics, amazing games. Some would even say that Castlevania Symphony of the Night is one of the best games ever made. So they should have been here on this PS Classic, and I don't know why they aren't. It's probably something with licensing issues or anything, I guess. If not, then for shame. They really should have been on there. And then I would probably switch Siphon Filter for Tenku, Stealth Assassins. Once again, that's a personal choice. I like the stealth in Tenku much more. And then finally I would probably switch Rainbow Six for Medal of Honor as my final pick. Because Rainbow Six on the console isn't the greatest choice at all. It received negative reviews, so it shouldn't have been on here to begin with. It's not a classic. The PS Classic will be arriving in stores on December 2018 for about $100. In my opinion, it's not worth the price with the library as it is, but it might have been worth it if it had games like Chrono Cross, Suikoden 2 and Castlevania Symphony of the Night included. Anyway, this was just my personal opinion about the upcoming PS Classic. I will be happy to hear about yours. What are your favorite games on the system, and which games would you have included on the PS Classic? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll be seeing you guys next time.